Welcome to the Fresh and Safe podcast, where we share fresh ideas and practical insights to elevate food safety in the produce supply chain. In this 6-part series, we explore the Fresh Produce Safety Centre's journey, food safety guidelines, emerging regulations, real-world case studies, and global food safety trends. Whether you're a grower, a service provider, or part of the broader food safety ecosystem, join us as we navigate the evolving landscape of fresh produce food safety in New Zealand and Australia. Welcome, everyone. I'm Farzana Adams. I'm the CEO of the Fresh Produce Safety Centre. And the Fresh and Safe podcast is a fresh take on produce food safety, brought to you by the Fresh Produce Safety Centre. In this pilot series, we explore the origins, evolution, and future of fresh produce food safety in Australia and New Zealand. From guidelines and regulations to real-world case studies and global perspectives, this podcast shares the conversations, challenges, and ideas driving better food safety outcomes across the sector. I'm joined today by my co-host, Susanna.
Thanks, Farzana. Hi, everybody. The Fresh and Safe podcast is for fresh produce stakeholders seeking to elevate food safety practices across the supply chain. Across this 6-part pilot series, we will share practical insights on real-world stories and fresh perspectives covering everything from Fresh Produce Safety Centre's journey and the latest guidelines to emerging regulations, innovative case studies, and global food safety trends. Whether you're a grower, a service provider, or part of the broader food safety community, join us as we navigate the evolving landscape of fresh produce safety in Australia and New Zealand.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Susanna. So today is all about unpacking the fresh produce food safety guidelines. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by 3 guests today that will help us explore this. I'm going to start with Dr. Sharon Horton. Sharon, could you please introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for saying, Susanna. It's a great initiative with the guidelines. So I'm the technical and editorial lead. I completed the 2022 update and now working through the 2025 guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And Elizabeth, Dr. Elizabeth Frankish.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Elizabeth Frankish, and I'm a consultant in my company Food Minds, and also do some lecturing on food safety at Murdoch University.
Fantastic. And look, those of you that listened to episode 1, you heard from Emeritus Professor Robin McConkie about Elizabeth being one of the PhD students as part of the Fresh Produce Safety Centre's early initiatives around food safety research. And last but not least, Richard Bennet, welcome.
Thanks, Susanna. Hello, everyone. Yes, Richard Bennet. I was part of the editorial team that developed the guidelines, various versions, 2001, 2004, 2015 and 2019. And I still do a little bit of food safety and horticulture consulting.
Thanks, Richard. What a pleasure we have for our listeners to be joined by Sharon, Elizabeth, and Richard today. So in turn, I'm going to ask each of you to tell our listeners a little bit about how you became involved in fresh produce food safety. Elizabeth.
Okay, well, having a degree in agricultural science, I've always been interested in primary production and worked with primary production supply chains, various supply chains, throughout my career. The fresh produce industry came into focus for me in the 1990s when the laboratory I then owned and operated began testing fresh produce and water samples for growers to meet their QA requirements. Becoming involved in fresh produce food safety was a natural fit, and I was already advising the food industry on implementing monitoring programs and interpretation of the data they generated, and on hazard analysis and risk assessment for QA programs. I find fresh produce food safety incessantly interesting and challenging, and I believe that with my scientific background and experience, I have a responsibility to help our fresh produce industry thrive.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Elizabeth. I think you remind me of something Frank Yanis says, and I quote, fresh produce is the last frontier in food safety. So absolutely a challenging and exciting space to be in. Sharon, can you tell us a bit about how you got involved in this space?
Thank you, Viviana. My background is in food science and technology with international experience across various food sectors, including the meat industry. When I transitioned into the ready-to-eat fresh produce sector in Australia, I encountered a unique challenge: the absence of a kill step in the supply chain. This required a comprehensive understanding of the microbiological control measures beyond my immediate technical responsibilities of the processing facility. It became essential to assess and manage potential contamination and growth risks at every stage of the supply chain, both forwards and backwards. From field and irrigation practices to the correct wash baths aimed at achieving minimum to low microbial reduction, supply chain temperatures, and also validating shelf life at the final retailer. Having worked through, unfortunately, a number of fresh produce recalls, I'm committed to ensuring the food safety risks throughout the supply chain enhance food safety for Australian and New Zealand's consumers to enjoy our amazing fresh produce. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think the fact that we don't have a kill step certainly introduces a very unique risk profile for our industry that needs to be managed through prevention. Really appreciate that. Richard, tell us a bit about your background and history with produce safety.
Thanks, Susanna. It's been a long journey. I'll try to keep it short. My distant background is in agronomy and technical matters in the deciduous fruit industry in the Goulburn Valley. And somewhere around 1997, 98, we started hearing from growers and packers that their wholesaler was asking them to send a copy of the last page of their spray records in order for the business to be accepted as an approved supplier. Bear in mind that at that stage, most supermarket supplies came through wholesalers. Other growers and packers were being asked to send a copy of their SQS certificate, whatever that was. Most hadn't heard of it. There's a huge gulf between those two requests: expensive, confusing, at times angry, certainly uninformed, and I wasn't the only one hearing all this. Others in similar roles to myself around the country were getting the same drumbeat from growers who were quite confused about what their next step was and what the repercussions were of not doing anything. Somehow or other, that group gravitated together under the leadership of Scott Ledger from BPI Queensland, and under his leadership, we developed a publication called "Developing an Approved Supplier Program for Fresh Produce: A Guide for Customers and Suppliers," and that was the foundation document, I suppose, that got some sort of level playing field happening. And certainly at that stage, the food safety bug had bitten me, and there was no escape. And I and others who were in that original group are still out there plying our trade, addressing issues. We've been addressing issues ever since, and intend to do so for a while yet.
Thanks, Richard. Clearly, you don't really need much of an introduction to our listeners and our audience today, because most people in industry will know you.
I hope it's for good reasons.
Excellent. I think I'm going to hand over to Susanna.
Well, it's fantastic to hear how you've all come to be in the world of fresh produce safety. And I think it is testimony not only to your technical expertise, but clearly your passion for food safety as well. So with that, I thought I'd ask you all each, and maybe starting with you, Sharon, is how have you got to become involved with the review of the fresh produce safety guidelines over the years?
Thank you, Susanna. While working in ready-to-eat fresh produce sector, it's my responsibility to ensure all our producers attained accreditation to Fresh Care and Global GAP. In transitioning our growers to these particular GFSI standards, we use the guidelines to help them understand the physical, chemical, and microbiological hazards present in production. We supported them in conducting the risk assessments and implementing the control measures to effectively manage and minimize these hazards that were identified. So then as a board member at the Fresh Produce Safety Centre between 2019 and 2023, I served as a chair for the 2022 guidelines review. And in that, we reviewed just section 6.2. It was a very debatable topic. It was on pathogen resistance in manures and amended soils. It was challenging, and we had 10 meetings over 18 months. We had a highly engaged group of 9 members in that team, and we had extensive external stakeholder engagement to update the guidelines in 2022. Currently, as the technical editorial lead, I'm collaborating with a technical team of 12 members, including representatives from academia and also industry, to conduct a comprehensive review of all of the guidelines, to pick up on all the great work that Richard and all the other members over the years have committed and been very passionate about updating. And we've commenced in late 2024, and Elizabeth's been a significant contributor to the review process so far. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, Elizabeth, you've been instrumental in this latest review. So really keen to get your thoughts and experience around reviewing the guidelines as well.
Okay, in the early 2000s, I was working with Graham McAlpine, who in Western Australia, who was then a QA consultant, and Tony Portman from DPIRD on some food safety guidelines for apple pack houses. That was as a result of some work that had come out of my lab, where we wanted to better understand the actual risk around some of the hazards we were detecting in fruit. And it was also around that time, therefore, that I met Richard and became a bit more involved with some people interstate. And so when the first guidelines group was convened, there was a lot of discussion nationally on what evidence there was to provide appropriate guidance to the industry. So at the start, I was a part of that scientific knowledge base, but it wasn't until the current 2025 guidelines that I became formally involved in the review committee. However, I have always included the guidelines as part of the toolkit for helping growers identify how to improve food safety controls. So I think it's an important document in that regard.
Well, that's great, Elizabeth. And I think, look, we'll talk more within this podcast about the usability of it. But it really is based on the knowledge of the people getting involved in the review, and none other than Richard. You've been around, as you've said, for many years. So can you talk us through your history with the guidelines and its review as well?
Yeah, thanks. It's unusual, but the impetus for the guidelines didn't come directly from industry. It actually came from government, from the old Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry Australia, who had convened a working group on safety and quality systems equivalence. There's a mouthful. Because they were concerned that the proliferation of QA schemes around at the moment was creating confusion, unnecessary costs, duplication, inconsistently meeting the requirements of the marketplace, if you like. Someone at a working group meeting suggested that what we needed was a base level of technical information that would apply to any of those schemes that were available at the time. If you remember back then, there was ISO 9000, there was SQF 2000, there was EuroGap, there was FreshCare, you could be audited to Codex HACCP, etc., etc. So there was a whole range of things out there. It was quite confusing. So AFA backed the development of the first version of the guidelines, and our little QA network delivered it. Our thinking was that the code or the standard gives you what you must achieve in order to be successful at audit. What we needed was something that articulated why you actually need to undertake those steps and how to do it. And so it's become the foundation document for that, regardless of the standard that sits on top or that you're trying to achieve. So that was that's why we're at it. The why and the how, and the guidelines have achieved that ever since version 1.
That's great. And I think, look, you touched on that, Richard, around, that burden of compliance. And that's where the guidelines can really come in, because it is based on scientific evidence. And it's trusted, is, a resource that can be picked up and used pretty quickly to try to reduce that impact in time to industry as well. So No, thank you all for your incredible input and I'm sure a number of hours in the reviews as well to keep it current and updated.
Thanks, Susanna. Richard, a quick one for you. You talked about sort of the regulatory driver around pulling this together. You were part of PMA Australia, New Zealand at the time, and then also involved with the Fresh Produce Safety Centre, Australia, New Zealand. Can you talk a little bit about the relevance of the guidance for both of those countries?
Well, it was a conscious decision made in the 2015 version, I think, to drop on farm from the title and get all of this whole supply chain involved. And also where there were New Zealand references that differed from Australian references for whatever purpose, regulatory, for example, then we needed to incorporate that into the guidelines. So, because then I was under the umbrella of PMA ANZ and the Fresh Produce Safety Centre ANZ, it was just natural that the scope of the document would be broadened to encompass additional areas and additional location, if you like. So, that, if you like, was a significant jump up, and subsequent versions have carried that on.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So truly a trans-Tasman resource. So we're going to dive deep into some of the bits of the guideline. Richard, I'm going to stick with you here. Can you sort of talk about who the guidelines are intended for? Because you've talked a bit about why they were created. So who are they for?
Yeah, I don't think who are they for has no limit, really. Primarily, growers and their QA staff and the consultants that they have advising them on these matters, academia, students. There's another group as well, and that's it reminds me of someone I bumped into ages ago who said that I cut my teeth on QA. What do you mean by that? And she said, well, I joined the business as a QA person, not knowing what that was. But in that role, I was able to touch all aspects of the business, from site selection through to the marketplace. And it empowered me, and it brought in skills that others in the business didn't have, and made me more valuable to the business to start with, but also more likely to take on management roles, because I had this in-depth understanding of how the business works based on putting together a QA program for the business, like a user manual for the business, I think it was described as. And I think that's a really powerful testimonial, and those sort of things, keep us doing what we're doing.
Richard, just wanted to add to the list there of users. I remember the first time I ever picked up the guidelines as an auditor, actually.
Yes.
And it was all, you get interpretation of standards, but the guidelines were just just a great foundation for anybody getting into the horticulture space as well. So yeah, definitely a great audience there. So Elizabeth, we'll pop over to you, and I just wanted to ask you, what are the scientific principles that really underpin the guidelines?
Yeah, okay. The guidelines are based on the Codex Principles of Food Safety Management and Control, which incorporate evidence-informed risk assessment and a HACCP-based approach. Also, industry good practices that are used internationally have been integrated into the guidelines, so they're as current and useful as possible. The guidelines have been developed and reviewed by ensuring the latest scientific information is assessed in the context of the requirements of a HACCP system. Now, we recognise that not all organisations have a full HACCP system in place, so the guidance provided takes a HACCP-based approach so that food safety controls are consistent with HACCP, and it provides users of the guidelines with a framework to build on and pursue their food safety program or system of choice. The guidelines are written and structured in a way that educates and encourages the reader to apply risk assessment within their operations. And in this latest review, we've taken a more holistic view of food safety control, which is consistent with how the private certification schemes and the regulatory authorities now approach food safety requirements. we want growers to have tools to understand where they should focus their improvement efforts and resources. And these guidelines are one of those tools we consider.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Sharon, you have done such a fantastic job in pulling together the comprehensive review that's currently underway. I just wanted to ask, for our listeners' sake, could you just point out the key areas that are covered in the guidelines and also some of the recent updates they can look forward to?
Certainly, as Elizabeth has alluded to, it's hazard-based. We look at the hazards, and there's various chapters on how we manage those through controls. So water, planting. But the exciting part is the new chapters that we've added in. Chapter 19, which is the critical incident management. For example, potential risks of adverse weather events, which we seem to have climate change and a lot of those extending circumstances with flooding. Chapter 20 around food safety culture and underpinning that with food safety objectives as well. And we've had a real uplift, significant change in Chapter 16, which is managing allergens. And the guidelines now pull allergens out as one of those individual hazards that you complete your risk assessment with. The appendices have also had an overview and update as well. Appendix 1 now is Food Safety Management System, including HACCP, which Elizabeth's just spoke about. We've also mentioned in that chapter Appendix Food Fraud and Food Defense. Appendix 2, and thank you for your workshopping and all your resources in that respect, Susanna, for the regulation overview to support the compliance with the updated Australian-specific primary production and processing standards. And of course, as Richard indicated, we also have the New Zealand Food Act requirements because these guidelines are for Australia and New Zealand. And the technical team working on this document were both from Australia and New Zealand, which really helped with updating those guidelines across the Tasman. Appendix 4, due to the recent spinach recall, are really understanding the significance and use of fecal indicator bacteria for detecting contamination has also been included. And we had great microbiologists on the team for that particular uplift in the standard as well.
That sounds fantastic, Sharon, and we're really looking forward to some of those updates. And just to our listeners that may have tuned in for our first podcast, Andreas, touched on some of those emerging issues and, crisis management, and we spoke a bit about the food safety culture and the regulations. So in many respects, the updates to the guidelines are actually addressing some of those key challenges that are still lying ahead of us. So that's, great work by yourself and the team there. So Elizabeth, just back to you. How can businesses best use our guidelines? What do you think the best way is?
Well, I think the guidelines allow businesses to identify the hazards that are relevant to their operations and their potential risks. And we spend a bit of time in the guidelines to tease out the difference between hazards and risk, because that's an important differentiation for everyone in the supply chain to understand. So they can go to the relevant sections, as Sharon has outlined, to find out about those hazards. They can then make use of the decision trees, the tables, and the matrices to determine what controls they need to implement or improve within their individual operations. They should then be able to identify where they need more specific advice or assistance, because we do recognise that often that will be the case in critical situations.
Right, Elizabeth. And then looking to the other sections as well, those prerequisite programs that really do then build that robust system in place as well.
That's excellent. What a great conversation. I just want to come back to Richard. And Richard, based on everything that you've heard us discussing now in this podcast and the number of years that you've been involved with fresh produce safety and the centre and the guidelines, what do you think are some things that businesses could be doing to get better value out of the guidelines and all the work that goes into this?
To get good value out of the guidelines, I think it's refreshing when I see businesses who are able to hold a conversation with their auditor or their QA advisor, because the guidelines have given them a level of understanding of exactly what Elizabeth was talking about, the difference between hazards and risk, and those sort of issues. I'm sold that there'll be many businesses that will benefit by this. The layout, we love a good decision tree, and that sort of just makes everything more clear, understandable, logical, and and that's what we've set about to do. Each version, I think, how can this be improved? And each version is an improvement. We're living our own mantra, if you like, of continuously improving, our resource document and making its application far and wide.
Kind of takes the guesswork out of it.
Early. Yeah. And I love that analogy. We'll walk in the talk, Richard. Continuous improvement. Yeah. Excellent. Wow. Thank you so much for making the time. I can't believe the time has flown so quickly for this conversation. So I think to round out the conversation, I'm going to come back to Sharon. And Sharon, can you share with our listeners? Remember that we have a wide range of stakeholders that might be tuning in and listening to our podcast. What are some of those key takeaways for implementing the guidelines for good food safety outcomes?
Oh, firstly, a key benefit of these updated guidelines will be the release of the revised and new fact sheets, along with the one-page producer guides. You can't always have that book out in the field with you, and they're available in multiple languages. So these resources will be accessible on the Fresh Produce Safety Centre website to support the guideline users in their every day-to-day operation. Secondly, the guidelines, we truly believe, will continue to drive the food safety consistency in training, implementation, and auditing across the fresh produce sector. And then thirdly, we're planning to complete ongoing updates to the guidelines driven by the continued collaboration with the regulators, industry stakeholders, academia, informed by the latest scientific research. And I'm also hoping to tap into, it's amazing, extensive collective knowledge and experience of the 80 plus members of the Fresh Produce Safety Centre community of practice, to workshop further guideline topics. And I'm sure the listener out there, if you're interested in joining this group, Susanna is the one to contact. And it's amazing the amount of cross networking that you can do in that group as well.
Fantastic. Wow. Thank you so much. Is there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners before I spend a bit of admin time telling people where to find them?
You're pretty happy, I think. I'm looking forward to it.
Keep learning.
Keep learning.
And if possible, if you're a user, please come to our website. We'd love to hear your feedback because it is about continuous improvement. We're open to the people on the ground using them. Some of the guidelines you can read by chapter. You may feel it's a little repetitive if you read the whole book, but we're not sure that you have time. You might just jump in and say, I need to look at what my watering testing should be, because we know water's not static. You just don't get a test result. It's very dynamic. So hopefully in our risk assessment, and as Elizabeth indicated, look at the decision trees and how we can help you make decisions about how often you need to do testing. So good luck with them.
Excellent. Well, Sharon, Elizabeth, Richard, thank you so much for making the time today to join us, to share your knowledge and your expertise with our listeners. And to our listeners, please engage with us, subscribe to our Fresh and Safe newsletter, follow the FPSC on LinkedIn to stay up to date with our latest resources and events. So please join us in episode 3, where we deep dive into some unique case studies from New Zealand focused on water quality and responses to crisis and incidents. Thank you for joining us.